Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a really pivotal moment reported by the New York Times involving the Trump administration, Israel, and Iran.
Yeah, it's a fascinating situation. The core issue, as the Times laid it out, was this reported plan by Israel for a preemptive strike.
A strike against Iranian nuclear sites.
Exactly. They were apparently deeply worried about how fast Iran's nuclear program was moving forward.
Right. And the reporting suggests this wasn't just talk. Israel supposedly had actual plans ready, maybe even for action, as early as next month, based on when this was reported.
And a really crucial part of this, was their assumption. They seem to be counting on the U.S. under Trump to back them up.
So why the urgency from Israel's side? What was their thinking?
Well, according to the Times, it boiled down to real alarm over Iran's nuclear progress. They felt there was only a limited window to act decisively.
To stop what they saw as a major threat.
Precisely. And beyond just the nuclear aspect, it seems they also wanted to sort of reassert Israeli deterrence in the region, make a strong statement.
Okay, so a sense of urgency, a need to project strength. But then comes the twist, because despite Israel expecting U.S. support for a strike, Trump didn't go for it.
That's the surprising pivot the Times highlights. Trump ultimately rejected the military path and pushed for diplomacy instead, negotiations with Iran.
And the reporting outlines a few key reasons for that. One big one seems to be just wanting to avoid another costly, drawn-out war in the Middle East.
Absolutely. There was definitely a sense of fatigue with those long conflicts. Plus, the Times points to this belief that diplomacy, maybe, could actually achieve more in the long run.
Like getting a solid, verifiable deal to stop Iran's nuclear program.
Exactly. Something potentially more lasting than a military strike, which always has unpredictable consequences.
The reporting also touches on domestic politics, right?
Right.
The idea that maybe the American public just wasn't up for another foreign war.
Yeah, that likely played a part. And, a successful diplomatic deal could have been a big win for Trump, bolstering that deal-maker image he cultivated.
So it fits into what the Times called a kind of broader strategic recalibration, trying negotiation first.
Sort of. Engaging adversaries diplomatically when possible, rather than defaulting to force. It's a significant shift in approach.
But getting to that decision wasn't smooth sailing within the administration itself, was it? The reporting talks a pretty serious split.
Oh, definitely. A significant and growing rift, as the Times put it. It really shows there wasn't a clear consensus at the top about how to handle Iran.
Two very different camps pushing in opposite directions.
Absolutely. On one side, you had let's call them the interventionists.
Okay, who are the key figures there?
The Times mentions General Michael Kurilla, head of CENTCOM, and National Security Advisor Michael Waltz.
And their argument?
Basically, preventative warfare. The idea that you need to eliminate the threat before it fully materializes. They saw military action as necessary to protect U.S. and allied interests.
So neutralize Iran's nuclear potential and show American resolve.
That was the core idea. They believed decisive military action would do both, and also reaffirm America's strength.
And General Kurilla was apparently providing detailed military plans.
Yeah, the reporting suggests he laid out specific strike options, casualty estimates, contingency plans, the works, focusing on a, quote, limited, highly targeted operation.
And Waltz, what was his perspective?
He seemed to argue that a show of force would actually reassure allies in the Middle East who were maybe getting nervous about U.S. commitment.
Because the underlying fear was Iran getting too bold.
Yeah.
Destabilizing the region through proxies.
Exactly. Places like Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, that was a major concern highlighted in the reporting.
And they were worried that if the U.S. didn't act firmly, countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE might start looking elsewhere for security, maybe towards China or Russia.
That seems to have been part of the calculus too, yes. For this camp, acting against Iran was also about preserving America's leadership role globally.
So much bigger than just the nuclear issue. It was about regional power, alliances, global standing.
High stakes, definitely. But then you had the other side pushing back hard.
The advocates for caution and diplomacy.
Right. Key figures mentioned here are Vice President J.D. Vance, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard.
And their main message was?
That a military strike would be a huge mistake. That it could unleash this devastating chain reaction and uncontrollable escalation with potentially catastrophic results.
Gabbard specifically, what were her warnings focused on?
Her focus, according to the reporting, was very much on Iran's network of proxy forces. She warned about how resilient and widespread they are.
You mean groups like
Hezbollah, various Shiite militias across the region, yeah. She apparently painted a picture of a potential widespread insurgency targeting U.S. personnel and assets everywhere.
So not a clean war, but more like guerrilla warfare.
Exactly. Asymmetrical warfare, the Times mentions. The fear was it becoming this sprawling, chaotic, multi-front conflict with no easy wins.
Targeting embassies, bases, maybe even oil infrastructure, using things like drones and cyber attacks.
That seems to be the kind of scenario she was warning about. Precision weapons, cyber capabilities, a sustained campaign of sabotage, assassinations, psychological ops, basically a nightmare scenario of continuous attrition for U.S. forces.
Wow, okay, that's a sobering picture. What about Hegseth? His concerns were more economic.
Yes. Hegseth reportedly zeroed in on the economy, particularly the Strait of Hormuz.
The oil choke point.
The big one. Nearly 20% of the world's oil goes through there. He warned that if Iran tried to block it using mines, fast boats, whatever the economic impact would be catastrophic.
Unprecedented oil price spikes.
Absolutely. Sending shockwaves through global markets, causing massive inflation, hitting consumers directly, at the pump, in the grocery store.
Potentially derailing the whole economic recovery that was happening.
That was the fear. And beyond that, the risk that adversaries like China or Russia could exploit that kind of economic chaos. It could lead to a global recession, political instability, a real weakening of the international order.
Huge economic risks. And Vance, what was his angle?
Vance, according to the Times, looked at the broader strategic and diplomatic fallout. He argued another Middle East war would just drain American resources, money, attention.
And damage alliances?
Severely strain them, potentially fracture them. NATO, partners in the Middle East, plus the immense financial cost landing on taxpayers for potentially generations.
He was also worried about America's global image.
Yeah, the risk that rivals like China and Russia could step in, looking like the reasonable ones, while the U.S. gets bogged down again. And Iran could play the victim card internationally.
Portraying themselves as victims of aggression. Gaining sympathy.
Exactly. Leading to America becoming more diplomatically isolated, making it harder to build coalitions. He apparently drew parallels to Iraq and Afghanistan.
The unwinnable quagmire argument.
Right. Warning against repeating those experiences, getting stuck in something that deepens divisions back home and erodes public trust.
So the common theme for Vance, Hegseth, and Gabbard was basically restraint, learning from the past.
Strategic restraint, absolutely. Prioritizing diplomacy, understanding the long-term consequences, arguing that real strength is about wisdom and patience, not just military power.
Okay, so you have these two powerful opposing arguments clashing within the administration. And in the end, Trump sided with the caution camp.
Ultimately, yes, he opted for the diplomatic route. The reporting states the first round of indirect talks happened in Muscat, Oman.
Oman often plays that role, doesn't it? A neutral ground for difficult talks.
It has that reputation, yeah. Facilitating delicate diplomacy.
And who is involved in these talks?
The Times names Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araqi leading their side, and Steve Witkoff, the U.S. Special Envoy for the Middle East, leading the American delegation.
And what was actually discussed? Was it just the nuclear program?
It sounds like it was pretty comprehensive. Nuclear enrichment, yes, but also sanctions relief, regional security stuff like missiles and proxies, even potential intelligence sharing and humanitarian issues.
And how did those first talks go? Any signs of progress?
Well, both sides publicly called them positive, constructive, substantive, which, is diplomatic language, but it suggests at least some willingness to engage.
But tempered with realism.
Oh, definitely. The reporting stresses cautious optimism, acknowledging the huge challenges and the potential for things to fall apart. Spoilers could easily emerge.
Still, the fact that they scheduled a second round for April 19th, also in Muscat, that signaled some momentum, right?
It did. It showed, at least at that moment, a commitment to keep the diplomatic channel open, fragile as it might be.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive, based on the New York Times reporting, shows a really complex situation. Trump's decision not to back a potential Israeli strike and to pursue talks with Iran instead. It wasn't simple.
Not at all. It involved balancing fears of another war, strategic calculations, economic worries, domestic politics, all while managing this deep split within his own team.
You had compelling arguments for hitting Iran hard and fast, and equally compelling arguments about the catastrophic risks of doing so.
It really gives you a sense of the intense pressure and the high-stakes calculations involved at that level of foreign policy decision-making.
And it definitely leaves us with something to think about. Considering everything we've discussed, the arguments for intervention versus the warnings against it, what do you think was ultimately the biggest factor pushing Trump towards diplomacy? Was it the fear of war, the economy, politics? And how different might things look today if that other path, the military one, had been taken? It really underscores the complexity of these choices when facing down a potential crisis.